Wonders and Miracles podcast, where we celebrate miraculous moments in everyday lives. I'm Liza Lawrence. I'm glad to have you join me as we celebrate wonders and miracles together. All right. Well, I am happy to be here with Nicole today from Wisconsin, and she's going to share a story that happened to her family and specifically to her husband. Back in May, he had a traumatic brain injury, and she's going to share the experience she had and the miracles that were seen during this time. So, Nicole, thanks for being on the podcast, and tell us what happened.
Hello, Liza. Thank you for having me. So in May, my husband and I celebrated our 17-year wedding anniversary on Mother's Day. And just a short 2 weeks later, our lives changed forever. Amidst COVID, we had just come out of quarantine in Wisconsin, and it was kind of the first time that you could socially distance and go and do things, with friends. And so we really toyed back and forth if we felt like it was the right thing for our family for him to go on an annual boys' weekend. They decided to go, and with a great group, I think it was emotionally what they needed to do as well. And the very first evening, I got a call at about 10:55 p.m. My daughter and I had just settled in to watch a movie, cuddled in mom and daughter movie night with the laptop in my bed. And I honestly thought it was his friends just being silly or, just to say hi, because I had talked to him at 9:30, and at 10:55, my phone rang and I picked it up. And I think if you know that moment your life is about to change, or if you've experienced it, that feeling that still chokes me up. And I knew that something was desperately wrong for us. Thank goodness that everyone involved at every moment did the exact right thing, without a moment to spare. And so my husband had fallen and hit his head. That was really all that anyone knew, and was not responsive. And so the emergency medical team was on their way and had decided they were going to call med flight. He was about 45 minutes away. We do live near a level 1 trauma center, thankfully. So he was actually going to be med flighted basically back home. And I was told just to meet at the hospital. And I'm a healthcare administrator. And so I think my entire professional career has really prepared me for fight or flight and to go exactly into what do I need to do mode. And I immediately knew I needed to get help for someone to come and watch our daughter, and I needed to get up to the hospital. He was admitted as a John Doe via med flight when they landed. And so I was greeted in the emergency department, and immediately the reception staff member said, "Are you the head injury patient's wife that's being med flighted?" And I kindly reminded her that his name was Michael. They immediately escorted me with a social worker into a private office, which again, I knew was not what I wanted to happen. I am a really transparent person by nature. I'm a very clear communicator, which can be a lot for a lot of people. Those that love me, thank you. But my intention is always to seek understanding and to ensure that those with me in this journey we're learning together. And so through those moments, they had no idea what was going on. And 2 or 3 people appropriately, tried to brace me that he was, not doing well. And so he presented as a Glasgow-Coma scale, which is a neurological scale of rating someone's level of consciousness. So they're looking at, can you make eye contact? Are you able to move on command and things like that? And he was a Glasgow-Coma scale of 3. You and I right now, Liza, are a 15, which means we're alert, we're healthy,
Wow.
we're moving our limbs, and we're, doing great. A 3 is virtually as low as you can be. So they had prepped me that he most likely would not survive the night. I was fortunate enough that my best friend had taken me up to the ER, and she's a advanced practitioner within the healthcare system that we were at. And so we were able to talk them into letting her come into the room with me amidst COVID, meaning nobody was supposed to come in. And so she came in with me. Not that I needed her as a clinician, I needed her as my best friend. She just sat there and held my hand, and I still didn't react. I made the decision very early on not to contact his family until I knew more, because I didn't want to cause undue panic when I had no answers. And I didn't want their initial reaction of, we're coming to you, we want to be with you, when they couldn't. COVID was very tragic during this time because I had to go everything alone with him. But in a way, it allowed me to protect those that love him the most, in that I knew I was fighting no matter what, and giving up was never an option. But going through it alone allowed me to be able to control at the moment, based on their emotional reaction and talking with me, what did they need to know or what didn't they need to know for those moments. And so I made the decision to wait to contact his family, as I said, because again, I wanted to make sure I had the right information. And all we knew was his medical exam, so his CT scan, which is imaging of his brain. Nothing was really clinically diagnosing why he was only demonstrating agonal breathing, which is basically just reflexive breathing. He was not able to respond to any commands. He was not able to open his eyes. His pupils were not dilating. And I still wasn't able to see him during any of this time. And so a resident came in, a resident team member, to talk about that they had wanted to do a surgery to basically put a tube into his skull to help with his swelling. They weren't sure that that was necessarily something that would be life-saving measures for him, but that would be something to help them understand what was going on. That resident was, I remember in that moment, he was in full personal protective equipment. So he had the face shield, the masks, the yellow gear that you see on all the TV shows. Again, I'm lucky enough that I'm very comfortable with it. I work in this world. And he never looked at me. He looked at the floor. He said several times, and he was very soft spoken. I am confident in all of his training in residency, he never signed up to tell a 40-year-old woman that her husband was not coming home.
Yeah.
And I stopped him and I said that I needed him to slow down. I needed him to look at me, and I needed him to remember that this was my husband and he's not just a patient. And if this surgery they wanted to do was not going to be time sensitive on the outcome of his life, I needed a couple of moments to think about it. And I asked him if he could step out, and he said, absolutely. He still isn't responsive, but I'm going to go and check on him and I'll come back in about 10 minutes. And so he stepped out, and my best friend, again, who's a advanced care provider, she's a physician's assistant. We just sat there, and I don't actually even remember if we talked. And I decided that I didn't know if I would sign the paper or not, the authorization to do the surgery. Because again, what was the quality? What were we talking about? And why would I put him through that if we weren't going to impact what his story would be? And in about 3 minutes later, that resident came in, and he had this look of sheer relief through his mask, through his PPE, through his face shield. And he said, he's responding. I don't know how, but your husband is responding. And I don't think we should do the surgery right now. And he grabbed it from me. He folded it in half and put it in his pocket and said, I'm going to go and work on him, and we'll be back.
Wow.
And he left. That was the first time we saw a miracle. Was we went from this emotional shift of he wasn't going to survive to he's still incredibly in critical condition, but we have something.
Yeah.
And so about 10 minutes later, they came back in and said, if you'd like to come and see him. He was on a ventilator. So when I say he was responding, he was able to open his eyes on command. They were dilating, or his pupils were dilating. He was able to move his arms and legs on command. It was incredibly difficult for him, but he couldn't speak. He wasn't alert by any means. But when I went in to see him, he just looked like he was sleeping. And he looked so peaceful, like he had the night before when I kissed him and went to bed. We were really, really fortunate. He had no other bodily injuries. He just hit his head during the fall. So that meant that going from the ER, we were just going to be admitted. They were going to take him into the neuro ICU for his ongoing care. So in neurological care, there's a couple days that are really key points, one of which is day 3. And so his accident was a Friday night. He was intubated the entire day on Saturday. Because of COVID, I wasn't allowed to stay with him. So around 6 a.m. is when he left the ER and got in to be admitted into the neurological ICU. I had to go home and I committed to our daughter, who is 8, from a very early moment, I had to realize that she would never forget how I responded. I never took that lightly. And so I committed to myself that I would never lie to her. I would never let my fear for scaring her omit what I felt she needed to know. And so when I got home that morning, she was, of course, awake. And overnight, I had called my parents, who were about 3 hours north, to be with her. They stayed about 14 weeks with us after his accident. And I remember hugging her, my daughter, and she said, "Mommy, is daddy okay?" And I said, "Baby, I don't know, but I promise you that I will never lie to you and we can do really hard things." And that was always her and my commitment was through tragedy, you can do really hard things. She now tells us that she could always tell if I was being honest with her when I would come home from seeing daddy, because she would ask me a question and she could tell by my heartbeat if I was being, honest, or if I was nervous to tell her. Again, she's 8. And so part of my goal here is to remind the parents out there that don't sell your kids short. They absolutely understand, and they're so much smarter than we think they are.
So I
Um,
teach child development, and children are so intuitive how they read people and how they can feel the essence of people. It's true. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the scary thing about a traumatic brain injury is that no two are alike. And so my husband on Saturday was intubated the whole day. We were never able to interact. He did respond. They did neurological checks on him. And so I went home that night, went to bed. Of course, I called every 2 hours overnight to talk to the neuro ICU nursing staff, who were so patient and so great. And when I got there on Sunday morning, I think my husband just really wanted to affirm that this was his story and he was going to write it. And I got there and he was still on the ventilator. And one of the nurses, I'll never forget her, she said, "Darn it, I'm bummed that you're here right now. We wanted to surprise you." And I said, "You wanted to surprise me? My husband's in a coma, but let's talk about that." And she said, "Just step out for a minute." And I stepped out. When I came back, he had been breathing so strong over the ventilator that they decided to extubate him. And he looked at me like nothing had ever happened. And he said, "Good morning, babe." And I had to step out again because I'm not a tearful person by any means. But that moment, to hear his voice after everything he had been through, and he was just so him. He was my boy, That was a really overwhelming moment. And that's, again, another miracle that we were able to see. He doesn't remember any of it. We spent that entire day together eating. He had passed a swallow test. He was doing really well, and they brought therapy in and he was able to walk. He brushed his teeth that night. So many things, that presented that day, that I felt the first time in 48 hours that I could take a deep breath. I left that evening and called his friends and our family and shared with them the great successes that we had that day, and went to bed and actually got a really good night's sleep thinking I'll see him in the morning. And when I got there the next morning, he was okay, but he was really tired. And my husband is he's a really goofy person by nature. And so if you've ever met a human who speaks movie is what we laugh. I think everything he somehow throws in a movie quote about something. And he's so kind and so empathetic and probably just your genuine one of the good guys. And he was not that day. He was so drastically different. He was very short tempered. He was very childish. Finally, around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my gut just knew something was drastically wrong. And one of the nurses said, "Something seems off with him, but I don't know him. What are your thoughts?" And I agreed with her, and we requested that they did emergent scan to check. We found out that he was hemorrhaging, and this would have been day 3. Day 3 was not good for us, and our good day from day 2 drastically turned traumatic. He was hemorrhaging on the right side. He had severe temporal lobe damage, so much so that they took out a portion of his temporal lobe on the right side, thus meant they needed to do a craniectomy, which is they remove a portion of your skull. And when they went in, decided that some of his brain and his temporal lobe was so damaged, they needed that space for him to swell. And he was in surgery probably, I think around 6 p.m. And the surgery took about 5.5 hours. I remember after they took him away, I just slept in his hospital room for a while before the sweet nursing staff said, visiting hours are over at 9. He's still in surgery. You do need to go home. And so I left, and his neurosurgeon called at about 11:55 and said surgery had gone well. Michael was still in critical condition, but he was very clear at the end of that to say he didn't believe there was any other surgical intervention or clinical intervention that they could do to help him. And my perception of that conversation with him was, it's really up to Michael now. I should have known that Michael, as I said earlier, was going to write his own story. And so I got there the next morning, and I was met with social workers before I could go in to see him. And we talked about that he would most likely be on a ventilator for several weeks. We talked about that he may not be able to move his left side. He would have significant memory loss, but to the extreme, we didn't know. And again, no two brain injuries are alike. And so I'm fortunate enough that I have really dedicated friends and family that are clinicians as well. And I was able to have a neurologist in my back pocket that could help me understand in addition to my own experience. And I really knew that surgery was choosing between death or disability for my husband, as harsh as that is to say. What I didn't fully understand was what the disability could have been. I'm not sure, had I fully understood that, what I would have consented to, if I'm very honest. That meeting with the social worker, they talked a little bit about where would he go. He most likely wouldn't be coming home anytime soon. How would we manage this? And I finally just stopped and said, again, I just need to see him. I appreciate all of the advice. I'm absolutely a clinical driven person. So I knew that all of the information they were giving me, I had to take it, but I also had to go and see him at that moment. And when I walked in, this would have been Tuesday morning now, the nursing staff again said, darn it, we were hoping to surprise you. And I said, okay, I'm done. No more surprises. They explained to me very clearly how the ventilator worked. And so what they do is they set you at a certain amount of breaths that would be your minimum. And the ventilator in his case was not breathing for him. It was just catching him. But they could tell from post-op till current, this was probably around 10:30 in the morning after he had his surgery, that he was breathing so far above the ventilator when he was agitated that they wanted to try him without the ventilator. And so they extubated him again. And again, he said, "Good morning, babe." What? And this time I didn't step out of the room, but I solidified any doubt that I had of, I have to follow Michael and I have to follow his intuition. And if he's not giving up on us, then until that moment, we don't have any other story to write except for his. Those 4 days were really the critical time. That time frame of him, I mean, he was eating lunch with me by 2:00 in the afternoon. He was up and walking and irritated that the nursing staff, had labeled him as a falls risk. And he was obviously on an IV with all the medications. He had drains, so he had intracranial pressure monitors. He was kind of a pain in their bottom and definitely, worked hard. I don't want to discredit anything and the nitty gritty of how traumatic this could have been and still was. We had no idea. When he woke up, he couldn't move his left side. Even when I say he walked, he drug his left leg. His balance was significantly decreased, and he was incredibly impulsive. So one of the things with a brain injury that happens is you don't recognize, like if you hurt your leg or break your leg, your brain has those pain sensories to tell you your leg is broken, that hurts. When you hurt or break your brain, you don't do that. And
Wow.
so he had no recollection and no understanding of the accident, or that he was med flighted via helicopter. He had numerous times would have to ask, where are we? He didn't know day from night. He didn't know, it was just constant. But he was miraculously discharged from neuro ICU after 11 days. to go to the general care floor. He was only on general care floor for 3 days. We were doing inpatient physical, speech, and occupational therapy the whole time. 3 days later, he was discharged to go to an acute rehab facility that focused on neuro injuries. And I was prepared that he would be there for probably 4 to 6 weeks, is what they had anticipated. And after 4 days, they requested a care team meeting and said that at this point, he wasn't getting additional value. He was showering on his own, whether they approved him to or not. Again, I mentioned earlier, he was kind of a pain. During that time, I had opted to give him his phone back because during COVID, it was really difficult. He wasn't allowed to leave his room. We live out in the country, so he's very used to hiking and doing our yard work and, being outside. And so being trapped, in his opinion, in a hospital room was really detrimental, I believe, at that point in time. I think that acute rehab for many patients is exactly the place they need to be. We were really fortunate that, again, we were experiencing this miracle that allowed him to come home 19 days after his accident, and he walked himself out of the hospital. We do have a convertible, and he was frustrated at me that I didn't pick him up in the convertible. I said, "You're missing part of your skull. I'm a little scared to drive you home." And we got home, and I believe in our case, him coming home and having so much more freedom really heightened him to excel in his therapies that maybe weren't even guided physical, speech, or occupational therapy, but just the nature of being home, being able to go for a walk, being able to put puzzles together for our daughter. He just had so much more activity for his brain to redevelop. And that pace just never slowed down. And so he had his craniotomy, which was to replace his skull. We were really lucky that he had no damage. He had fractures on the left side of his skull, but not on the right, which is where he
Mm.
hemorrhaged. And so we were able to use his original bone to put back. And that's a pretty scary thing to think about. But everyone assured me, this is a piece of cake. This surgery is nothing. And he went into surgery on August 26th. At around 90 minutes, they said, "Everything's all set. The surgeon will be out to see you in just a little bit." And my heart dropped. And I instantly went, well, they said this was going to be like a 2 to 3 hour surgery, and it was just like an hour and 20 minutes. What happened? And the sane part of me knew, well, they're not going to come and give me horrible news. He didn't code on the table. They're not going to tell me that in the waiting room. He was just done so quick. Everything fit perfect. And he recovered so quickly that within 45 minutes from that, he called me from post-op, said he was hungry, and, asked when I was going to come up and see him. I ate dinner with him, and we were discharged the next morning to come home. And that was August 26th. He was released back to driving on September 14th, which was my birthday, and he went back to work on September 23rd. And today is a month that he's actually been back at work with no restrictions. And he makes dinner for our daughter. He picks her up. He had coffee with me this morning as he made us breakfast. And by all accounts, you would not know. The miracles that we've been given have really helped me to realize what we were going through and how you're so much more capable of things that you don't even think you are. And I think it's human nature to sell yourself short. And I think before this, most people probably would have described me as the gritty one in our relationship. He's the calm, I'm the storm. And I'm okay with that. We've coined a term for our family over the last several years, well before this, but and our term is GGR, which is give grace to yourself and others. Always have the grit to work hard and to be resilient. And to watch him through this has been the most gratifying thing that I've loved him for 17 years, and our love story, I don't think either of us are spectacular independently, but I think our love story is. And to go through this really does show the miraculous support of family. And I didn't mention a lot of our family and friends that were there through the heavy, heavy times that really allowed me to do nothing but fight for him. And both of our employers were incredible. And when you talk about the community that goes into someone's recovery, I think it's just nothing short of spectacular. And to share our story was so important. So thank you for letting me do that, because in those early days, I had no positivity in the
Mm.
stories. I had positivity because I decided to close off what could be. I remember our clinicians giving us a binder, and it was probably about an inch and a half thick of what could happen. And I started to read it and I shared it with some of my family, and I went, this is just horrifically scary
Yeah.
if at this point that's not the journey we have to travel. And my heart sends prayers to those families that are traveling that. It just wasn't our journey, and I had to shift my priority to what he's overcome and be able to again focus on us as a family. So telling our story has just been something that's really important to me, because I so desperately needed that hope and positivity from such an early time in our story. So there we are.
I love that. Thank you so much. And I think that that was one of my questions. What advice would you give families that are going through this? And I think you answered that we need hope, right? Like
Absolutely.
that sense that there is goodness coming, and where we focus really does matter, because it does affect how we support one another, I think.
Absolutely.
He sounds like a really determined, like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to get better. Is that
Yes.
kind of his nature, or did you see that come out as a new sort of characteristic after this?
That's a great question. He is probably the hardest worker I've ever known. He is an incredibly selfless man. His girls are his world, but his work ethic was there before. He never stops, ever. He's an incredibly gifted carpenter. And I think just so many things, as you mentioned, are he doesn't know any other speed except for 150. And that can be overwhelming for some of us when we just want to relax and have coffee on a Saturday morning. He doesn't know how to do that. But I think in this aspect, it really played in his favor, because he just couldn't let himself just sit there. And in regards to your brain, is if you don't use it, you lose it. And
Mhm.
it's hard to be on this side of the pendulum as someone loving him through. And I think all of our family and friends that have supported him, through this, or have supported me through, is we went from the depths of almost losing him not once but twice, to now all of a sudden, call us if you need us. He's off all of his medications. He, as I said, he drives himself to work. And the interesting thing is, I don't question his judgment. I don't question even knowing his diagnoses, which are, an entire page long. He's just overcome every obstacle, and there's just no manual for any sort of trauma. And what we've learned together again is just the human spirit. You're just so much more capable than what you ever thought you were. And there is so much beauty in even what we've gone through. The gift that came of this is I've been married and with him for so long that you don't mean to take those you love for granted, but I think you do unintentionally. You think you're invincible. You don't think this would happen to you. I never thought that morning that when he kissed my daughter and I goodbye, he may not come home to us. And the gift of being able to recognize that I love him more than I ever thought is something that I'm incredibly grateful for. And the gift to live our lives with a purpose, that we've really been able to build this understanding of what a gift it is to truly look at the world in a different way, that nobody wants to, and you don't realize it until you've suffered personal tragedy.
Mhm. Yeah. What have you learned specifically, like when you say you look at the world in a different way, what has changed how you see things?
Really just understanding what matters. And does that matter today, tomorrow, or in 4 years? And when I go back to 10:55 p.m., maybe 10:56, if I think once I could take a deep breath and really hear what happened, there is nothing physical that I own that I wouldn't have given up to make sure my husband could be here for my daughter and I. And that stands true today, is to remember your why and what's important to you, which gets
Yeah.
lost, especially as we're complaining about COVID.
I agree. I
you
agree.
know,
And I think that's true for all of us, even without COVID, just taking life for granted and not really prioritizing the most important things. Being-
absolutely.
I love that. And I love your GGR, the grace, grit, and
Yeah,
resilience. I think
yeah.
that's awesome. As I
It
teach
is gender.
yeah, as I teach child development, that's one of the things we talk about, how resilient people really are. And I
Mhm.
think that human spirit is phenomenal when
Mhm.
we're working through really hard times. And I love that you said that to your daughter too, that we can do really hard things.
Yeah,
And
yeah. And she's
yeah,
so wise. But it was difficult. She couldn't go see daddy in the hospital. We did a lot of video chatting, but he didn't look like himself. He was so
yeah,
swollen. As you mentioned, our GGR is most of my family, if they listen, are going to laugh because that's on any card I write. It's on any, well, if you graduate in my family, I'm going to write that as my note for you. Again, just work hard, and it really does move mountains. I thought of that as our mantra, as just being good people. I didn't think of it as our mantra in survival mode. I'm grateful that we've had that that basis,
yeah.
because we were really put to the test over the last 5 months.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm so happy for you that your story had miraculous outcomes. Michael, sounds amazing, honestly, to just work hard through this whole thing. Anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
I've done a lot of education too, with reaching out to thank, a lot of times critical care EMTs and emergency response personnel. They don't know what happens to their patient afterwards.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was really important to Michael and I to write them letters and send them a photo of our family. We just had our family photos taken last weekend, and to share with them that everything they did led us to here, and to make sure that they knew that we were really, really grateful. And that's been a really gratifying relationship to start. And so we're hopeful that we'll be able to go and meet them.
What a sweet idea. I love
Yeah,
that idea.
yeah.
I think my
It
all
was,
my listeners should remember that and do
yeah,
keep that
yeah.
in mind. Yeah. I love that. Well, thank you, Nicole. It was wonderful to hear this story, and I love that you had a miraculous outcome.
Well, thank you so much, Liza. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to this miracle story. Please subscribe to